Hello everyone, and welcome to Act 5, Scene 1 and 2 of Julius Caesar. So today we find ourselves in the beginning of this epic battle that's going to take place between the forces of Brutus and Cassius on one side and Antony and Octavius on the other. So as you know, we skipped over Act 4, and really the two key things that we see as important in that act in terms of the plot is that these two distinct groups start to begin to formulate their plan in terms of attack, right? And you also see this struggle of power, right, between Octavius, Antony, and the third member of what will become the second triumvirate. And then on the other side, you see this struggle that Brutus goes through as he wrestles with himself in the aftermath of what they've done. And namely, we see this occur in the appearance of Caesar's ghost to Brutus in the middle of the night. And not only is this occurring with Brutus, but also his wife Portia commits suicide in the aftermath of what's going on. Because remember, all of Rome has turned against the conspirators, and so they begin to one by one execute and exile those who were responsible. And so Portia, as the wife of Brutus, right, is an obvious target, and so she ends up taking her own life. So Brutus at the beginning of Act 5 has not been having a very great turn of events in terms of what has occurred to him after the killing of Caesar. And so as we dive into these two scenes today, we're really going to see this struggle continue between these two forces and also within each force, as there's this struggle for control and for power in each. So please, before watching this video, do make sure that you have gone through and read Act 5, Scenes 1 and 2 from your literature textbook, as I will not be doing the dramatic reading for this video. Diving in then, we start off by understanding what's going on between Octavius and Antony. And the first thing that we see in terms of Octavius and his character, because remember, having skipped over Act 4, this is the first time we're really introduced to him. And we start to begin to see that as a younger character, certainly in comparison to Antony, he is more gung-ho in sense of how he comes at this battle between themselves and Brutus and Cassius. And he emerges in this sense here. He says, "You said the enemy would not come down, but keep the hills and upper regions. It proves not so. Their battles are at hand." And so here, Antony, being the intelligent military man that he is, gathered that Brutus and Cassius would stay up in the hills where they would have a better vantage point in terms of being able to protect themselves. And here Octavius is simply saying, "You said this and it's wrong. They're coming down, they're coming to fight, and this is our moment to shine." But Antony strikes back and he disagrees. And he almost treats Octavius in a childlike manner, right? Like, tut tut, like you don't know what you're talking about. He says, "I am in their bosoms, and I know wherefore they do it." And remember this wherefore meaning why. And literally, he's not saying that he's in their chest, that he knows from that sort of sense what's happening with them biologically. He means this in the sense that I understand their inner workings, right? He's already correctly tricked them before, so it's safe to say that Antony's assumption is right. And he says that this is just a false sign of courage, right? They're coming down from this hill because they want us to think that they are braver than they actually are. And then the messenger enters to tell them of what they already know, that for Octavius and Antony, they're about to be met with Brutus and Cassius, and that Brutus and Cassius have their bloody sign of battle hung out, meaning that, for example, any of you who watch Game of Thrones, for example, the episode for Battle of the Bastards, where you have Jon Snow on one side, and he's battling against this other character who's slipping my memory at the moment, but when they battle one another, right, they come and they have their flags flown with the symbol, the emblem of their house. And this is a sign to say that I am ready to battle, I'm ready to fight you. And so we see that for Brutus and Cassius, they're also coming down the hill with this same readiness to fight. And now here is where we see the first instance of struggle for control between Octavius and Antony. And in the previous slide, we saw that Antony has commanded Octavius to be on one side of the field, and Antony will take the other, meaning they're setting up their battle front. But Octavius says, "Upon the right hand I keep thou the left," meaning, no, you go on that side and I'll go on this. And Antony rightly questions him, "Why do you cross me in this exodus?" Meaning, why are you disagreeing with me right now when the battle is about to start? And this sort of puts Octavius in his place. He's right, no, that's not what I meant. I will do what has been asked. And now we have the entrance of Brutus and Cassius, and from this point until we see Octavius and Antony exit later in scene 1, it's just going to be a constant back and forth of people throwing insults and jabs at one another because there's this epic tension between them. Remember, Antony was the best friend of Julius Caesar, and Octavius is the great nephew of Julius Caesar, so both of them have very big reason to be upset at Brutus and Cassius. And on the other hand, Brutus has placed his trust in Antony at the last part of what we saw in Act 3, and we see that trust is misplaced because Antony essentially tricks Brutus and turns all of Rome against him. So the last time these people saw one another, it did not end well. And so when we see this first bit of talk here between Brutus and Cassius and Octavius, I want to make a point here that when Antony addresses them, he says, "No, Caesar." Here he's addressing Octavius, okay? He's not going to mention Caesar again in the sense of the first person or the present tense. He's always going to talk about him in the past tense, right? So it's a good way to distinguish between the two. But this moment, right, shows a moment of tension in, are they going to fight? Or are they going to talk, meaning to parley, right? The same word in French. What's going on here? Why have you come? And after a few back and forth blows, Brutus sort of begins this conversation by saying words before blows, meaning let us talk before we fight. Right? He's confirming, right? Is that right? Countrymen, right? Using that word in particular to put themselves on an even playing field. And you have Octavius jabbing right back. Not that we love words better as you do. So Octavius here coming in with his youthful energy, right? It's not that we love to talk, right? We love battling, right? You're the one who likes to talk. But Brutus, right? Not one to be slow in his words, says good words are better than bad strokes, Octavius. So sort of saying, I would rather be a good speaker than a bad fighter like you any day. So we see this back and forth. And then here comes Antony with this big blow in terms of bringing up the past and the death of Julius Caesar. He says, "In your bad strokes, Brutus, you give good words. Witness the hole you made in Caesar's heart, crying, 'Long live, hail Caesar.'" You guys, this is so powerful because we're still using the diction around fighting versus speaking. And Antony says, "Brutus, you have done both. And the worst stroke of all was the one that you gave into Caesar's back." Right? And that stabbing, that literal stabbing in the back spoke for you, Brutus. And it showed the lack of honor and loyalty that you had for Julius Caesar. So Antony doesn't mince words, and he comes out straight with what he means, and he attacks Brutus's honor and his character. And here, Cassius is going to begin to speak, and he's going to stand up for Brutus, as he would, right? Remember, they're on the same side. And he says this, "Antony, the posture of your blows are yet unknown," meaning the shots that you're going to fire, we haven't seen them yet. "But for your words, they rob the Hybla bees and leave them honeyless." And so this would be a particular type of bee that they would have been familiar with in ancient Rome. And so Cassius is saying, "Antony, your words are so sweet," meaning full of deception and deceit, right? That you rob the very bees of their honey, right? So really implying that there's no difference between Antony and Brutus in the fact that they're able to use their words to get what they want. And so Antony, right, not one to sit back and take it, says, not stingless too, meaning, yes, my words may be sweet, but they also sting and hit right to the point. And we see that in his speech to the commoners, right, and how he riles them up in just a matter of moments against Brutus and Cassius. And again, we see this back and forth, back and forth. Honestly, it's like they're bickering with one another to this ridiculous degree, right? Rather than fighting, just throwing these verbal blows at one another. And Antony jumps in here, and he is going to use a number of similes to describe the depth of the treachery of the likes of Brutus and Cassius. And so in the first instance, he says, you showed your teeth like apes. So comparing them to apes, and for those who are unaware, right, in the wild, right, showing your teeth as an animal is a sign of aggression, right? I'm ready to fight. Right, so one, this sense that you guys like animals showed your disdain for Caesar, but in the same turn, you fawned like hounds, right? To fawn over something, right? To be loyal to or to flatter in a sense. And this continues in the next line, and bowed like bondmen or slaves, kissing Caesar's feet. So essentially saying, behind Caesar's back, you showed your true colors, your aggression. But in front of him, like slaves, you bow down, flattered him, and pretend to love him. And he goes one step further by particularly honing in on Casca, the conspirator who gives the first blow to Caesar. And he compares him to a cur. And remember, we learned about that word already, this mongrel, meaning a dog who is untamed, who's dirty. And so Cassius, right, picking up exactly what Antony is laying down, he sort of says that it's not how it should be, right? And he says this to Brutus, right? And Cassius at this point has every right to be upset. Because remember, Cassius warned Brutus, we cannot let Mark Antony live. He needs to go. But Brutus said, no, Caesar's the only one who'll be touched. And then, after this point, when Antony wants to make his speech at the funeral, again, Cassius steps up, says, Brutus, this is a bad idea. So essentially here, when he's saying, this tongue had not offended so today, if Cassius might have ruled, he's essentially saying to Brutus, I told you so, and you should have listened to me. And now we hear again from Octavius, and again, in true, just fiery, youthful passion, he brings the attention back to war, to fighting. And he says essentially two things are going to happen, one of two things. Either when we fight, right, I will avenge Caesar by essentially killing all of these conspirators, or I will die trying. And Brutus then steps back in, and showing that he's this master with words, he says, thou canst not die by traitors' hands, unless thou bringst them with thee. So essentially Brutus is saying, if you die by a traitor's hand, it won't be by me, and it won't be by Cassius, because we are not the traitors. If anything, you brought a traitor with you, i.e. Mark Antony. And so here we clearly see that Brutus still holds to this idea that what he did was honorable. And again, continuing to go back and forth. It's like watching a match of tennis, the ball going from one end of the court to the other. And here, Brutus and Cassius jump in, and they continue to throw insults at Octavius and Mark Antony in particular, with Cassius going so far as to chide Octavius, calling him just this peevish schoolboy. I mean, you really don't know anything. And you're worthless of such an honor, right? It would be an honor for you to die in this way. And then he turns to Mark Antony and accuses him of being no more than a party goer and a playboy. So essentially saying, if this is the army we have to fight against, I'm really not that scared. And so we come away from this really understanding that if they were meant to accomplish anything in their speaking with one another, they utterly failed. And so after we see the exiting of Antony and Octavius, we're left with just the conspirator side of the army. And Cassius now begins to show his true colors in terms of his fears. Right? And the first instance we see that is here in this line, the storm is up and all is on the hazard, meaning everything is at stake. And he really begins to feel the weight of what they're up against. And we're going to have two things or two conversations going on here. And this is where it's important to pay attention to stage directions, because we see that Lucilius and Messala, two characters who are loyal to Cassius and Brutus, they are going to come in. And we see that Lucilius and Brutus have a conversation apart from Cassius and Messala. So the conversation we're about to discuss, where Cassius reveals his concerns to Messala, is not heard by Brutus or Lucilius. And so essentially, the big main thing that Cassius is saying here is that I have a bad feeling about what is going to come. Right? And first he says, "Be thou my witness that against my will, as Pompey was, am I compelled to set upon one battle all our liberties." And so he's referencing back to the war that took place between Julius Caesar and Pompey, this struggle, this just power battle. And you and I both know, right, that this didn't end well for Pompey. And so now, right, likening himself as Cassius to Pompey, we get this foreshadowing that it's also not going to end well for Cassius either. And we learn further down here that he also begins to show more of a superstitious side. And we get that with the allusion to Epicurus, who had a philosophy, right, of looking at signs. And he says, "And partly credit things that do presage," right? Meaning that I start to begin kind of to believe in things that foretell the future. And he says why. He says, "Coming from Sardis, on our former ensign, two mighty eagles fell," meaning the banner that they're marching in with, two eagles fall and they perch on top of them. And this is a good sign, right? Because in terms of symbolic meaning, eagles represent victory and power. So at first, right, Cassius is going to view this as a very good sign. But then he continues to tell Messala what he sees next. He said, "The next morning," meaning the morning that they are on now, "the two eagles have flown away, and in their place are ravens, crows, and kites. And these would have all been birds that were in particular signs of death," so bad omens. And so now he's relating what he sees in this shift in fortune in what's going to happen to them today. So he very much fears that they are going to lose. And so this is the mindset he comes into when Brutus and Lucilius rejoin the conversation. And he begins to share with Brutus his misgivings, right? His things that make him uncomfortable. And we see that Cassius is going to reflect that they don't know the outcome, right? "If we do lose this battle," he says, "then is this the very last time we shall speak together?" And so he asks this question next in light of that. In light of, "This may be the last time I see you, Brutus, my friend. What are you then determined to do?" And this is a question that draws us back to the very beginning of the play in terms of how Cassius references multiple times throughout, right, that he would rather die, to take his own life, than to be caught under the yoke of Caesar. And so although this yoke or this oppressive power of Julius Caesar no longer lives, we see a shining or an inkling of it in the potential victory of Antony and Octavius. And so we again have Cassius bringing up this question of, am I willing to do the unthinkable to escape this kind of life? And Brutus knows very well what he means. And we're going to see that Brutus takes a very different view of this type of death. And he names it very plainly. He says, "But I do find it cowardly and vile," meaning disgusting, "for fear of what might fall, so to prevent the time of life." Right? So he views suicide as a cowardly way to escape things that you can't even possibly know. And he continues, "Arming myself with patience to stay the providence of some high powers, right? Referring to the gods that govern us below. And so here he's saying, don't commit suicide. It's not a good idea. It's far better to face whatever fate has given us through the gods with courage and with bravery. And so here we see these two opposing views in terms of what is an honorable way to die. And so Cassius sort of brings up this question then, okay, so if you're not going to kill yourself, if we lose, are you willing to be led around like a slave through the streets of your own city? And Brutus, of course, a man who's bound by honor, would abhor that kind of treatment. So he says, think not, thou noble Roman, that ever Brutus will go bound to Rome. He bears too great a mind. And so this kind of foreshadows, in a sense, that all of this talk about death and loss, we need to be thinking that Cassius, for sure, we know what he would do if the time came. But what about Brutus? Are we potentially going to see that he holds these really high ideals, but then when it comes down to the thick of it, does he really stand by them? Or will he give in to different ideals, ideals that Cassius holds, for instance? And so then we have this final parting farewell between Brutus and Cassius. And again, they're making such a big deal of it, you guys, and particularly in terms of repetition, right? This forever and forever farewell, Cassius. Forever and forever farewell, Brutus. So we get the hint that this is most definitely going to be the last time that they see one another, that things are not going to end well. At least the play is hinting at it at this point in time. And then finally, we're going to end scene 1 and merge into scene 2, which is incredibly short, by seeing that Brutus comments that he wishes that he could know the future, right? So that he would understand how the battle is going to end. And this is a question, right, that, or a thought that we can relate to as well. Right? There are often times where we wish that we knew what the future would be. Right? For example, when are things now going to get back to normal? Right? A lot of us would love to know the answer to that question, but we just don't have it. And so we can really relate with Brutus and understand where he's coming from. That in some sense you would have this great sense of peace, at least in terms of knowing what would come. But you also have this question of, if I knew, would it change the way that I act, the way that I make my decisions? And so moving then into scene 2, and we have this scene so short. Again, Shakespeare does this on purpose, right? It's not that he got lazy and tired. He's breaking up these huge, great, intense scenes and sort of prolonging the facing of these two armies on the battlefield with this smaller scene. And essentially here, in this scene, Brutus is telling Messala to send these bills or these messages, these notes, to the legions or divisions of their army that are on the field, because he senses a weakness in Octavius in terms of their troops, and a weakness that he hopes to use to overthrow them. So again, Brutus and Cassius really serve as character foils for one another, not just in terms of their approach to life and the extent to which they have honor, but also here in terms of their optimism. So we see that Cassius very much believes that the end is near and that all is lost, right? He's the one who prompts these farewells between the two. Whereas Brutus, even now, in the midst of these concerns, is looking forward, and he feels that there is a way to succeed. So that is it for our discussion of Act 5, Scene 1 and 2. For tomorrow, please do make sure that you read Act 5, Scene 3 before watching the analysis video. And to date, we just have 2 more videos left to go. So we'll do one video on Scene 3, and then the final video that we'll do together as a class for this year will be combining Scene 4 and 5 of Act 5, the final bit of the tragedy of Julius Caesar. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.